What happened when this anchorman on live TV took Melania Trump too far? It shocked the world when the camera turned on and swept through a buzzing audience in New York City. The energy was frenzied, the popular primetime show. Viewers at home expecting the usual mix of scathing political commentary and jokes. But they certainly didn't expect this turn of events. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from. The audience in the studio buzzed with anticipation, expecting the usual blend of humor and sharp political banter. Mark Sullivan, the seasoned host of the popular late-night talk show, flashed his signature grin at the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with intrigue, "tonight, we have a guest that no one, absolutely no one, expected to see on this stage." A ripple of curiosity spread through the audience. Some leaned forward in their seats, whispering to their neighbors, while others simply stared at the stage, waiting. Mark paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the tension in the room. Then, as if the moment had been orchestrated for maximum impact, the stage curtains parted. Out walked Melania Trump. The reaction was instant. A collective gasp filled the room. Some in the audience clapped hesitantly, while others exchanged puzzled glances. A few murmured to themselves, clearly unsure of how to respond. Mark, despite being a master of composure, was momentarily thrown off. He blinked, quickly masking his surprise with a polished smile. "Melania Trump," he said, standing to greet her as she approached the chair opposite him. "Wow, this is unexpected." Melania, dressed in a sleek ivory suit, moved with the grace of someone completely unbothered by the reaction around her. She extended a perfectly manicured hand, shaking his with quiet confidence. "Thank you for having me," she said, her accent soft but deliberate. Mark gestured toward the chair as they both sat down. The audience, still processing the moment, settled into an uneasy silence. For a few seconds, it felt like no one, not Mark, not the crowd, and maybe not even Melania herself, knew exactly what was about to unfold. But one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be just another late-night interview. Mark leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on his desk. His usual easy charm returned as he studied his guest. "So, Melania," he began, crossing one leg over the other, "it's been quite a journey since your time in the White House. What's life like now?" Melania met his gaze without hesitation. "Life is peaceful," she replied, her voice steady. "I focus on my family, my projects, and helping children through my initiatives." Mark nodded, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something just beneath the surface. He wasn't here to have an easy conversation, and everyone in the audience knew it. Still, Melania's calm demeanor seemed to disarm him, at least for a moment. The crowd listened intently as she spoke about her post-White House work, her efforts to support underprivileged children, her advocacy for mental health awareness. "Interesting," Mark said after a pause. He shifted in his seat. "But let's be honest, many people criticized you for remaining silent on certain controversial topics while you were First Lady. How do you respond to that?" The energy in the room shifted. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. The question wasn't unexpected, but it was pointed. Melania, however, remained composed. Her hands rested gently on her lap. "I believe actions speak louder than words," she said simply. Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's a good line. But don't you think some moments demand words, especially when the stakes are so high?" His tone had changed, just a little. A subtle edge, like he was testing the waters before diving deeper. Melania tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I believe people have their roles," she said. "My role was to support my husband and our country in my own way." Mark's smile thinned. He leaned forward slightly. And supporting him meant staying silent, even when his actions or words created division. A few gasps rippled through the audience. The question wasn't just bold, it was incendiary. Mark folded his arms, clearly waiting for a defensive response. The room buzzed with anticipation, but Melania didn't flinch. Instead, she let the silence linger for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Division has always existed," she said finally, her voice as calm as ever. "Blaming one person for it is easy, but it doesn't solve the problem. I choose to focus on unity, not blame. The audience murmured. Mark seemed momentarily taken aback, but he quickly regrouped. Fair point, he conceded. But speaking of unity, there are rumors, controversies, things people want to hear from you directly. For example, your marriage. The room erupted in a collective gasp. Mark's smirk widened, sensing he was about to corner his guest. Melania's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a spark that suggested she was ready for this. And what came next would turn the conversation into something no one could have predicted. Mark leaned forward, his fingers steepled together, studying her like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. You know, Melania, he said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. A lot of people have wondered why you stayed so quiet during some of the biggest scandals involving your husband. Most first ladies, especially in modern history, have been more vocal. The audience murmured. Melania remained still, her posture perfect, her hands folded lightly on her lap. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it linger, stretching just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. I speak when I need to, she said finally. I do not believe in talking just to talk. Mark smirked. That's a very careful answer. It is an honest answer, she corrected. Mark exhaled sharply, shaking his head. But don't you think, at times, silence can be mistaken for complicity? Another murmur from the audience. He was pushing now. Melania tilted her head slightly, the smallest of smiles ghosting across her lips. That is what people like you want to believe. Mark let out a low chuckle, caught off guard. Oh, so now I'm the problem? I did not say that, Melania replied, her voice still perfectly even. But you make a living by telling people what to think. I do not. A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the crowd. Even Mark's smirk faltered for half a second. He regrouped. Okay, fair. But let's take a real example. When the Access Hollywood tape came out, the one where Donald was caught on a hot mic making, let's call them colorful comments about women, you didn't say much. The country was outraged. Women were outraged. People wanted to hear from you. And yet, Melania held his gaze, unblinking. And yet, I was exactly where I needed to be. Mark's eyebrows lifted. Which was where? With my son. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. The audience shifted in their seats. Mark hesitated, as if deciding whether to push further. He went for it. But didn't you feel a responsibility to say something? As a wife? As a woman? Melania's lips pressed together in something almost resembling amusement. Responsibility? She repeated. You want to talk to me about responsibility? Mark faltered. I was responsible for my family, she continued. For my child. For my own peace. That is what mattered to me. Not giving the media another headline to twist. The room was silent. Mark exhaled through his nose, sitting back in his chair. So, you're saying you don't regret staying silent? Melania straightened her posture. I do not regret choosing dignity over noise. The words hung in the air. Mark let out a breathy chuckle. Well, that's certainly an answer. Melania nodded once, her expression unchanged. Mark rubbed his chin, glancing down at his notes. Then he looked back up, a gleam in his eye. Okay, let's go deeper. Mark sat forward again, elbows on the desk, his voice dropping slightly. Melania, he said, his tone almost gentle now. There's a question that people have been asking for years. And I think, deep down, everyone in this room wants to know the answer. The crowd went completely still. Melania's expression remained unreadable, but something in the air shifted. Mark hesitated, then finally asked it. Do you ever regret marrying Donald Trump? A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Someone audibly whispered, Oh my God. Even Mark seemed to realize he had just crossed into dangerous territory. For the first time, Melania's expression flickered, just slightly. Not anger, not offense, but something closer to disappointment. She leaned forward, matching his intensity. Regret, she said, testing the word. It is an interesting thing. Mark swallowed. Melania tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharper now. Tell me, Mark, do you regret your marriage? The audience erupted in nervous laughter. Mark let out an awkward chuckle, shifting in his seat. Well, I mean that's not. You see, Melania interrupted. It is easy to ask a question when you do not have to answer it. Mark blinked. I do not live in regret, she continued, her voice smooth but firm. I made choices. I stand by them. Always. Mark cleared his throat. So you're saying? I am saying that people love to write stories about my life, she said. They do not know it, but they think they do. They think if they repeat something enough, it becomes true. She glanced toward the audience, then back at Mark. But here is the truth, she said. I know who I married. I know the life I chose, and I stand by it. The audience erupted into applause. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. You are one hell of a woman, Melania Trump. She smiled, just a little. I know. And just like that, the conversation had shifted. Mark had pushed her to the edge, and somehow she had walked away stronger. Mark adjusted his tie, his smile still present but noticeably thinner. He had thrown every carefully calculated question at her, yet Melania hadn't just deflected, she had dismantled them with precision. He cleared his throat, preparing for another angle. You know, Melania, he started, trying to regain control. People often say that when you stay silent, you let others define your story. Isn't it time you took control of the narrative? Melania crossed one leg over the other, tilting her head slightly. And what narrative do you think I need to control, Mark? Mark hesitated, just for a beat. Well, the one about your role in the White House, your marriage, the way the public perceives you. Melania raised a single eyebrow. And why, she interrupted, her voice still impossibly calm. Do you want me to explain myself so badly? The question landed like a punch. Mark blinked, thrown off. The audience immediately reacted, first with a few scattered chuckles, then louder applause. Mark started, but Melania leaned in slightly, cutting him off with nothing more than presence. Tell me, Mark, she continued, why does my silence bother you so much? Why do you think I owe you an explanation? The applause swelled. Mark's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time that night, the seasoned host, the man who thrived on control, was speechless. Melania let the moment breathe, her gaze never leaving his. You asked me about my silence, she said finally, her accent lilting just slightly. But perhaps the real question is, why do you fear it? The audience erupted. Cheers, claps, some even stood. Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. Well, he said, forcing a chuckle, that's a hell of a response. Melania simply smiled. Mark shifted in his chair, regaining his footing. All right, he said, glancing toward the camera with a practiced grin. I'll admit, that was a good one. But we're not done yet. Mark tapped his cue cards against the desk, buying himself a second to recalibrate. Let's talk about strength, he said, leaning forward again. Because, Melania, you have to admit, many people see silence as avoidance, as weakness. Melania didn't flinch. She lifted her chin slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried through the studio with quiet authority. Silence, she said, is not weakness. It is a choice. The room went dead still. Then, as if on cue, the audience erupted into applause. Louder than before. Stronger. Mark's expression flickered, just for a moment, as he realized he had lost the room. Melania let the moment settle, then continued. Some people use words to create noise, she said, but noise is not power. Power is knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. When to watch. When to listen. Mark exhaled sharply, shaking his head with an amused smile. Melania, I have to say you're handling this better than I expected. Melania met his gaze, perfectly composed. Did you expect me to fail? The audience roared with laughter. Mark threw up his hands. All right, he said, grinning. I'll admit it, you're good. Melania just smiled again. She had walked into his arena, and now it belonged to her. The moment the cameras cut, the energy in the studio shifted. The audience, still buzzing from what had just unfolded, slowly rose to their feet, breaking into applause that wasn't for the show, this was for Melania. Mark let out a breath, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. Well, he muttered, rubbing his temple, I didn't see that coming. Melania simply stood, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle on her pristine ivory suit. She turned to him, her expression still calm, still unreadable. You assumed I would lose, she said lightly, almost like an observation rather than an accusation. Mark let out a half-laugh, shaking his head. I assumed you'd play it safe. But you didn't. He studied her for a second. You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? Melania smiled slightly. Did I? Before he could answer, the show's executive producer, a tall woman in a headset, rushed onto the stage, her phone in hand. This is going to be huge, she whispered, trying to keep her voice low, but the excitement was clear. The clips are already going viral. People are eating this up. Mark shot her a look. Already. She turned the screen toward him, showing the flood of social media posts dissecting every second of the interview. Some praising Melania, some calling Mark out, some spinning conspiracy theories, but all of them engaged. Mark glanced back at Melania. She was still standing, poised as ever, as if she had already known this would happen. "You planned this," Mark said, more to himself than to her. "You knew this would go viral." Melania tilted her head. "Perhaps people are just tired of the same conversation," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and walked off the stage. Within hours, the interview was everywhere. Clips flooded Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Some showed the moment Melania turned the question on Mark. Others focused on her powerful line, "Silence is not weakness. It is a choice." Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Melania speaks, hashtag the power of silence, hashtag Melania versus Mark. News anchors debated her words. Pundits argued over what she really meant. Was this a quiet rebuke of her husband? A strategic comeback to reclaim her narrative? A sign of something bigger? On one side, people admired her composure, calling her a masterclass in grace under pressure. Others criticized her, saying she dodged the real questions. But one thing was certain. No one could stop talking about her. Even celebrities weighed in. A-list actresses tweeted about her unexpected media brilliance. Political analysts dissected her every sentence. Meanwhile, Melania ignored it all. She exited the studio through a side door, her bodyguards keeping photographers at bay. The black SUV waited at the curb, engine running. As she slid into the car, a reporter shouted, "Melania, what was the real message behind your interview?" For the first time, she paused. She turned her head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, just before the door closed, she gave a small, knowing smile. And with that, she disappeared into the night, leaving the world to wonder. Had she just defended her past? Or had she just rewritten her future?